Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and welcome to Writing on Games. 2016, in video games anyway, could be characterised as the year of surprises. Games I thought I'd love ended up being not so great, and games I didn't expect much from ended up becoming some of my favourites this year. It's the year we finally saw the release of games that had been in the works for many years, and that many people had thought cancelled. It's the year AAA games took risks and embraced humanity that indie games have been exploring for years, whilst the same indies went further with it, I guess. Dialogue was a key mechanic in some games, but what was equally as powerful and immensely surprising was its comparative rarity in others. Indeed, whilst the world around us crumbled in a dystopic cacophony of indecipherable noise, the surprising introspection of many games this year acted as a much-needed emotional salve. Whilst this year's industry happenings felt comparatively muted, outside of a few notable examples, this year still felt important, you know? I mean, even personally, this year has been an absolute roller coaster. I started this year with a few hundred subscribers, feeling like the work I was doing was rewarding, but like I was perhaps speaking softly into the void. Cut to 12 months and thousands of subscribers later, and this is becoming a bigger part of my life every day, something I never could have expected previously. I've written articles for some well-known publications, had my videos covered by the likes of Polygon, combated my anxiety and headed down to London on my own to meet with industry professionals, started a Patreon that has kept the channel going, got a PS4 sent to me by one of my patrons, meaning I could finally play Bloodborne, started a podcast with one of my best friends, Nico, and importantly, been introduced to many amazing creators, a lot of whom I'd now consider friends. Despite some significant dips in terms of my mental health here and there, upon reflection, 2016 has been a pretty amazing year for me. And I have every single one of you to thank for all of this. I couldn't be more sincere about it. You are all changing my life for the better every single day. I cannot thank you enough. But enough of all that dumb introspection nonsense though, this is a time for lists, a needless, ultimately meaningless competition. I don't know, I thought that in this spirit of reflection, it would be fun to do another list of the best games I played this year and talk a bit about why I enjoyed them so much. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all to the Writing on Games Top 5 Games of 2016 list, with some honourable mentions for good measure. And I'd like to kick things off at number 5 with The Witness. This game, as I talked about in my video on it at the start of the year, is a mess of contradictions. It's at once a game that treats its audience with utter contempt, and yet simultaneously encourages you to get better at every stage. It's a game that hints at a wider meaning in its philosophical musings, but then mocks the player for seeing it as anything other than just line puzzles. At one point literally stating that the products of human emotion are interpretations of the world that tell you more about the guy talking than the world he's talking about. Just think about how dismissive that makes the game seem about all of its own light narrative elements, for example. It's crazy. When I played this game initially, I kind of hated how it got under my skin so wholly with such a simple premise. How could a game about line puzzles be so infuriatingly complex, and why can't I seem to solve this one stupid maze? It made me feel downright stupid at times, and I get why many people hated that about the game. That said, when you finally crack that solution the game has been nudging you towards after staring at a maze for an hour, going away and then coming back to it, that eureka moment is almost unmatched by any other game. There is a craft to its contradictory design, a method to its madness. It's designed to make you constantly question your own feelings towards the piece, as well as yourself and art in general. To me then, in that sense, it's about as pure a work of art as you can get, and therefore easily finds its way onto my list. And at number 4 we have Dark Souls 3. Now, you know a year has been replete with standout games when a Dark Souls title can only make it to number 4 on my list. That is to say nothing of the game's quality though, because at the end of the day, it's more Dark Souls. In some ways, I'd even consider it on par with the first Dark Souls in terms of quality. Its combat feels better than the mainline Souls games perhaps ever have, with an increased speed and an emphasis on getting up close and personal, feeling heavily informed by Bloodborne, while still retaining the weight and precision of combat typically associated with a traditional Souls game. It's a delicate balance that I only really appreciate, having now played its predecessor and come back to this. I also love the world and enemy design, with a bright, often saturated colour palette being countered with some dank, dingy environments and some truly horrific foes. Large-scale bosses truly impose on you, with their size largely avoiding the typical big equals slow dynamic usually seen in games like this. The world also feels wonderfully interconnected, harkening back to the original Dark Souls. It's far from perfect though, and that's probably why it didn't make its way further up the list. As time has gone on, I've found myself wondering, why do they keep messing with systems that were perfected as early as the first Dark Souls? Now, the bonfires wholly exemplify this for me. Why does the interconnected nature of the world matter when there's likely a bonfire right around the next corner? As a result of this overabundance of bonfires, as well as the ability to warp between them given to you from the start, the world just doesn't feel as tightly designed as the first Dark Souls. Also, I guess I'm just beginning to get a little burnt out on Souls games at this point. Think how many videos I've done on the series this year. I recently completed Bloodborne, and it was great, and I'll be doing a video on it at some point soon. But one of the main reasons I enjoyed it so much was because it felt like a horror game first and a Souls game second. I guess even when the combat has been refined to a mirror sheen as it has been here, there's only so many times you can go back to it before people begin to tire of it. Even with all of that said, however, it's still a Dark Souls game, which kind of automatically places it in the upper echelon of games I've played this year. It's still an amazingly good time if you're into the Souls formula, and the amount I keep coming back to it reminds me of that fact. I guess I'm just really excited now to see what the team is working on next. And at number 3 we have Quadrilateral Cowboy. Oh god, I've wanted to talk about this game for so long, mainly because it does the seemingly impossible. It takes two things that you would think would be perfectly suited to the medium of video games, but have yet to really be effectively implemented, and realises them both with absolute ease. Those two things being hacking and heists. Indeed, Quadrilateral Cowboy feels like it glides through these seemingly hard to navigate activities utterly effortlessly. If you haven't heard of it, and I'm willing to bet that's a good deal of you, it's a game in which you hack your way into various compounds, espionage style, in order to retrieve documents and steal safes and airships. As the game goes on, you receive new tools that also present new, compelling challenges. Now, part of the game's brilliance lies in the fact that its facsimile of coding is simple enough that you don't need to know any languages yourself, yet it's also deep enough to reward those who are able to intuit the game's consistent logic. The time trial mechanic of the game encourages replayability, trying to hack, pardon the pun, seconds off your time. At first, you might be floundering around, experimenting and often failing with different coding and equipment combinations. By the time you're replaying earlier levels, however, you'll be chaining together long strings of commands, positioning yourself in just the right way, then executing on an intricately planned heist that ends up playing out in a matter of seconds. It really evokes the feeling of being a master spy when you can pull this stuff off, and it's a feeling that has kept me gripped despite the game's relatively short length. What's perhaps most intriguing about Quadrilateral Cowboy, however, is the unique design of its world. In terms of aesthetic, think Minecraft meets Blade Runner, down to the 80s look of the OS you use, through the lens of retro-futuristic Googie architecture. It's part of the Blendo Games universe, which also encompasses games like Gravity Bone and 30 Flights of Loving. You know, that one game that Jazzpunk borrowed heavily from. It feels distinctly singular in its look as well as its unique sense of humour. It also gets you asking questions about things the characters seem to be taking for granted. I mean, why is their base a flying boat? How in the 1980s are they committing heists through what is essentially a VR headset? How are they essentially using time travel for later heists? Why is a cat running a bike shop acting as a front for weapons and other less than legal hardware? It's all beautifully consistent in its execution though, and as such ends up retaining something of a magical realist quality. Its artistry doesn't just apply to the depth of its mechanics, but the unity of its world design. And whilst I could gush about its charm for ages, I'll leave it at this. Play this goddamn game. And in at number 2, we have Thumper. Now, if you've followed me for any length of time, you'll know that I'm a musician. I make the music for all of the episodes of the show, and hell, the second episode I ever made was about how music games fail to capture the joy of creativity involved in being a musician. Essentially, I have a particular interest in how the art form I'm a part of is represented in games, and until recently, I've been less than impressed. That's where Drool's recent release Thumper comes in. There is a way to represent music without needing to allow for creativity as such. Thumper, for me, manages to capture something that's perhaps even deeper than this. The panic, the dread, and ultimately the elation of playing live. How does it do this? Well, by abstracting the event entirely. Gone is the stage, the polygonal audience, and the endless butt rock found in more traditional music games, replaced by something that evokes Alien or Suspiria more than it does AC/DC. It's all wonderfully symbolic, and there is no attempt to glorify the process here. You're just a scarab beetle careening down a highway at ludicrous speeds, and if you fuck up, there's a severe penalty. The reason I love it so much is because there's such a brutal physicality to it all, that it reminded me of the key element of playing live. Things can and do go wrong, and you've got to both expect that and be ready to get back into the swing of things as fast as possible. It reminded me of why musicians practice. Ultimately, the notes are coming at you too fast for you to acutely perceive each one. You need to train yourself to intuit the process to a certain extent. So, like you practice on your instrument to get better at it, you repeat levels in Thumper until you just feel it, man. Getting to that zen-like state feels truly amazing. Even if you don't quite know how you navigated the unbelievable speeds and the odd time signatures that the game presents, I mean, really, when's the last time a rhythm game forced you to play in 5/4 or 7/4? There's a feeling of elation when you get to the end of a level. It reminded me of all the times I've shed sweat and blood playing aggressive music in a live scenario, and entering that uneasy trance where everything happens automatically, but you always worry that shit is going to hit the fan at any moment. No other music game has done that, and that's why Thumper is such an important game to me. Plus, it was designed and soundtracked by Brian Gibson, one half of Lightning Bolt, who were one of those real formative bands that got me into weird, fucked up music as a teenager, so I was pretty much bound to love this game from the get-go. If you're interested in more in-depth thoughts on the game, I actually wrote an article about it for Inverse that I'll link in the description. Essentially, if you're interested in music or rhythm games at all, you owe it to yourself to check this game out. And now, just like last year, I'm going to talk about some unranked honourable mentions before I reveal my top game of 2016. There's a lot to get through because, hey, this year was damn good for video games, alright? First off, we have Final Fantasy XV, a game that helped me realise just how effective silence can be in telling a story. And it surprised me in that, well, it was a Final Fantasy game that utilised it so well. It just missed a spot on the list due to a real loss of steam towards the end of the game, a sharpened focus on the game's unbearably dull main narrative, and utterly woeful penultimate mission made sure of that. However, when the game focuses on its clear strengths, riding along the open road with your buddies, taking down monsters, and watching this relationship grow, often without words, it's a real treat and a much more intimate Final Fantasy than most. Trackmania Turbo might not feature the sheer anarchy I so loved about the multiplayer of its previous installments. However, it still proves that Trackmania is one of the purest, fastest time trial racing experiences out there. Let me know when it gets its equivalent of the Star Wars Metallica course, and it'll be my game of the year every year. For now though, definitely go back and check out Stadium, it is wild. Now, there is no way you could have convinced me prior to getting my hands on it that a sci-fi military shooter would make it anywhere near this video, let alone have its main draw be the campaign. Titanfall 2, however, with its unbelievably liberating level design, stupendous variation through level-specific mechanics, and a sense of brevity that leaves you wanting more rather than wanting less, was so close to making it onto my main list. Plus, BT learning to give a thumbs up is the best shit in any video game ever, and I will not hear a word otherwise. The Last Guardian is another game that finally came out after almost 10 years. It certainly feels like a game that started development on the PS3 with some downright awful performance in some areas and controls that are finicky at best. That said, if you're into Ueda games like I am, you're going to be able to look past these quirks and admire a singularly artistic experience with a satisfying narrative escalation and payoff towards the game's conclusion. As Truffaut theorised, the failings of the auteur are inherently more interesting than an anonymously produced, polished product, and The Last Guardian acts as a pointed example of this. Campo Santo's Firewatch featured what was perhaps the most interesting use of dialogue this year, implementing it as the central mechanic of the game. It also handled player choice extremely well, realising that choices don't need to be world-altering to remain deeply personal. Add on top of that some amazing performances contributing to one of the most nuanced, heartfelt relationships in a game this year, and, well, it's just really good stuff. Let It Die is... let it die. Suda51 and Grasshopper have my time whatever they choose to do because of how fucking astounding Killer 7 is, despite their subsequent games feeling decidedly mediocre in comparison. Let It Die, however, is... let it die! It's an endlessly complicated mess of systems enclosed in a fairly drab set of corridors with mechanics that don't feel so great at first glance, and yet I can't seem to stop thinking about it. I'll be keeping an eye on this one for sure. Superhot, like Quadrilateral Cowboy, gets a lot of depth out of a few core mechanics. Its central focus on time manipulation provides a unique twist on your typical action game, taking a scenario in which you need to take out a room full of people and turning it into something of a puzzle experience. Each move you make changes the scenario ever so slightly, but requires a constant refreshing of the mechanics at play within the puzzle. It's this fact that the action takes place on a mental level rather than what's playing out on screen that makes the game so intense, and it's immensely rewarding as a result. There's Watch Dogs 2 as well, but I already reviewed that, so check that video out if you want to see why it's actually really good. And to close, it might not be a full game technically, but The Witcher 3 Blood and Wine has enough content that it could be considered one, and well, it's more Witcher 3, play it! Phew. And with all of those honourable mentions out of the way, I'd like to announce that my number one game of 2016 is... Hitman! Let me say this right out of the gate. No game released in 2016 has given me so much joy so consistently as this year's reboot of Hitman has. Now, I was as skeptical of the prospect of an episodic version of Hitman as anyone else upon its announcement, but a few episodes in and it began to feel more and more like the perfect way to release that game. It kept the game fresh in my mind and kept me anticipating each month's release of new content, as the game's design encouraged me to replay older missions and explore every facet of these wildly expansive levels. It got to a point where anyone complaining about the episodic model after about 3 episodes in was not someone I could realistically take seriously, due to the inordinate amount of content available and the frankly worrying amount of hours I'd put into the game even at that point. That said, volume of content alone does not a compelling game make, so what about Hitman makes it such a joyous experience? Is it the tense, high-stakes stealth gameplay? Is it the sprawling, open-ended level design? Or is it the sheer amount of tools at your disposal? Well, yes, those things do play a part, but ultimately it's all about how these fragile systems coalesce and how the player is encouraged to then break them that contribute to the game's defining characteristic in my eyes: its utterly absurd sense of humour. This is something that's incredibly hard to pin down, precisely because it runs so deep in the game's veins. Yes, there exists an opportunity system which guides the player along dumb, funny, scripted events, but the absurdity runs deeper than that. It surfaces itself in the way people don't recognise it as strange that a man pretending to be someone else has a different voice and a goddamn barcode on the back of his head. It's made clear through the fact that the scripting is so delicate that you can throw coins at someone making their big entrance down a staircase and the entire scene will stop before one person tells you to pick up your trash and the scene continues. It's evident in the fact that through an utterly insane chain of logic, turning off a stove in a kitchen can lead to other guards shooting you to death where you stand. It's beautiful, and the reason for its beauty is the fact that, like I say, it all follows a logic pattern. It's a warped logic that bears little resemblance to how normal human beings would behave, but it's a consistent set of rules nonetheless. The game's toy box element then comes not simply from the amount of weapons you get or whatever, but from the sheer amount of possibilities there are to mess around with the absurd systems in front of you. And it's from this that some of the dumbest, funniest, and also most tactical ways to dispatch your targets can arise. For example, there's nothing quite like socially engineering your target to appear at one location and then taking them out from the complete opposite end of the map. It makes you feel like you've manipulated some deep system, like you've become a master assassin, until you realise that you haven't yet killed the target and need to go back for a second shot. That's the part that makes you feel like if Larry David was an assassin, and it's the way these seemingly opposite feelings are so effectively juxtaposed that makes this game feel so uniquely joyous. Everyone has their own stories from playing this game, about how they gathered a bunch of unconscious bodies in a room and dropped a toilet on them, or how they dinged a coin off a wall at just the right time to distract the cavalcade of dumbass guards previously so focused on shooting them to death, or however many other examples. The important thing is that these scenarios are created by the player and ultimately resolved by them. And bear in mind, this is 2016 we're talking about here. A year which has provided us with so many depressing events that we have so little control over. It's perhaps poetic then that it also produces a game that not only exudes complete absurd hilarity, but also puts you in absolute control of it all. The fact is, whichever way I choose to look at it, it's inconceivable for me to envision any other game topping this list, and I am so excited to see what these guys have up their sleeves for Season 2. And that concludes my Games of the Year 2016 list. I hope you had as much fun as I did recounting the unbelievable amount of incredible games that came out this year. Also, as I mentioned at the start, this has been a hell of a year for me, and I couldn't have got to this point without each and every one of you. I'd specifically like to thank my patrons as well, who have made this show logistically possible through their financial support. I honestly cannot thank you all enough for encouraging me to continue with this weird, dumb endeavour I've been on. And hey, if you feel like pledging, it'd be the best Christmas present ever. I really hope you've enjoyed all the videos I've put out. Rest assured there's a lot more to come. I'll be back in the new year, but for now, have an absolute blast over the holidays. I'm Hamish Black, and this has been Writing on Games. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.